Ever heard of a king endorsing a god? Like it's the latest, sneaker drop or something?
Interesting analogy.
Well, that's kind of how one deity rose to the top in ancient Mesopotamia. It's like, imagine a world of gods, but they're all as dramatic and power-hungry as, like, a reality TV show.
Oh, I can see it now. The divine feuds, the power struggles, the quest for ultimate cosmic influence.
Right. Get ready to decode Sumerian-Akkadian mythology, folks, because the lines between, politics, local legends, and those epic tales that echo even into our time, they all get seriously blurry.
It's true. The competition between gods in this pantheon, it could fuel some seriously compelling drama, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But what always gets me, what I find most intriguing, is how the civilization, from literally thousands of years ago, still reveals so much about us.
About us.
Yeah, about the human need to explain the world, our place in it.
Yeah.
It's a timeless quest, really.
Okay, so we're talking clay tablets, a language that still has scholars scratching their heads.
Oh, tell me about it.
And beliefs that later cultures, including our own, borrowed from big time. It's like finding out your family recipe, your grandma's famous bread, let's say. Turns out it was actually inspired by ancient Mesopotamian baking traditions.
Precisely. And that's what we're going to do today. Dive deep into the heart of two cultures, the Sumerians and Akkadians.
Right, because they occupied the same space for centuries, right?
Exactly. Think of it like, trying to understand a conversation where two different languages are being spoken at the same time. You're catching bits and pieces, trying to piece it all together.
So we've got these puzzle pieces, right? Myths, hymns, king lists even.
Oh yeah, and we're not just piecing together the stories themselves, but the entire worldview behind them, the way they understood their reality.
And just to be clear, when we say Sumerian, we're talking seriously old, folks. Like, we're talking the world's first known writing system, cities popping up where there were just villages before.
True pioneers.
Pioneers, exactly. But their language, oh man, it's like nothing we've ever encountered. It's not related to Indo-European languages or even to Semitic languages like Akkadian.
Yeah.
It's a real head-scratcher for linguists.
Oh, it makes you wonder what other secrets are buried within those yet-to-be-deciphered texts. What amazing discoveries are still waiting for us.
Right.
But even with what we have translated, the picture that emerges is, well, it's fascinating.
So fill us in. What were some of their core beliefs?
Well, for example, the Sumerians, they believed in a three-tiered universe.
Okay, like levels.
Yes, levels. Much like many cultures throughout history, actually. You had heaven above.
Makes sense.
Earth in the middle.
Solid, logical.
And below, you had Irkalla.
Okay, now before anyone pictures fire and brimstone Irkalla, this wasn't hell, right?
Right. It wasn't about punishment in the afterlife. Not at all.
Okay, so what was it?
It was a completely separate realm with its own set of rules, its own gods, even its own sense of time. Imagine it as a mirror world, coexisting beneath the surface, where, life and death functioned completely differently.
So a bit like a parallel dimension, but with its own, let's say, unique laws of physics and social customs.
Exactly. And ruling over these different realms, we have a whole cast of gods and goddesses, the Sumerian-Akkadian pantheon.
Hit us with some of the highlights. Who are the big names on this divine guest list?
Well, you've got Abzu, the god of fresh underground water.
Essential for life in that rather arid land.
Absolutely. Then there's An, the sky god, dwelling in the highest heavens.
Makes sense. Sky god up in the sky.
Right. And let's not forget Gibel, the god of fire. Now, he was a powerful deity capable of both forging and destroying with equal might.
It's like they looked around at the forces that shaped their lives,
Yeah.
right? The storms that could flood their fields in an instant, the fire that cooked their food or could burn down their homes. And said, okay, there must be a god for that.
Precisely. And they weren't shy about attributing human-like personalities and motivations to these gods, complete with rivalries, love affairs, power struggles, you name it.
Oh yeah, because we humans don't have a monopoly on drama, do we?
Not at all. These gods were just as messy, just as complicated as any group of people.
I was just thinking, with all the rain needed in Mesopotamia, that storm god, he must have been a big deal.
You're right on the money. Ishkur, also known as Adad in Akkadian, was the god of storms and weather.
So he was responsible for both the life-giving rain, but also those devastating floods.
Exactly. Farmers would have been pleading with him for favorable weather, while kings might have called upon him to unleash, those storms upon their enemies.
Wow, talk about wielding some serious meteorological power. But it's interesting you mentioned kings appealing to gods, because wasn't there this one god, a wind god, in fact, who ended up top dog in this whole divine hierarchy?
You're talking about Enlil and his story. Well, it's a prime example of how intertwined religion and politics were, even in ancient Mesopotamia.
So spill the tea. How did this wind god rise to the top?
Well, you see, you might assume the sky god An would be considered supreme, right? I mean, he ruled the heavens after all.
Seems logical.
Right. But in Sumerian-Akkadian mythology, it was Enlil, the god of air and wind, who came to hold that position.
Okay, plot twist. So how did that happen?
Well, the answer lies in one of the most famous pieces of literature from that time, the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Ah, Gilgamesh. Now we're talking.
Yeah.
This is a story that's not just survived for millennia, but is considered one of the earliest surviving works of world literature. Okay, so we got this epic poem, right? This story about a king, Gilgamesh, on this crazy quest for the secret to immortality. But how does that, boost the status of Enlil, this wind god we were talking about?
Well, think about it this way. The version of the Epic of Gilgamesh we have today, the one that survived all these years, it originated in the city of Uruk.
And Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, right?
Exactly. And guess who was considered the top god in Uruk? Enlil. So as Gilgamesh and his city grew in power and influence, their preferred deity, well, he got a boost too.
Okay, so it's almost like, I don't know, like a branding exercise.
Yeah, kind of.
Gilgamesh, this legendary figure, he's essentially endorsing Enlil as the supreme god.
Precisely. And this idea, this endorsement, you could say, it spread alongside the epic itself. As more people heard the story of Gilgamesh, they also learned about Enlil's supreme status. It's a powerful example of how local beliefs could gain wider acceptance, especially when they were tied to a compelling narrative or a powerful ruler.
So it's like a celebrity endorsement, but for gods.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But just to zoom out for a sec, if we were looking at a map of ancient Mesopotamia back in the day with all its different city-states,
right,
would each city have had their own favorite god, their own local version of Enlil?
That's highly likely. Each city probably had its own patron deity, its own unique myths, its own local legends, all these threads coming together to form this incredibly rich tapestry of belief.
It makes you wonder, though, what stories haven't survived. What other gods might have been considered, like the ultimate top dog, the supreme ruler of the cosmos, in their own time and place, but are now lost to history.
It's a tantalizing thought, isn't it? And it highlights a really crucial point. Even those grand, sweeping narratives, the ones we often associate with ancient cultures, they were built on a foundation of local customs and beliefs, individual experiences, whispers around the fire, stories passed down through generations.
It's like a reminder that history is always more complex than, the simplified versions we often hear.
Exactly.
So to really understand a culture's mythology, we can't just focus on the big names like Enlil or Gilgamesh, right? We have to consider those smaller, localized beliefs within communities and families. The stories that weren't necessarily written down, but were just as important, maybe even more so, to the people who lived by them.
Absolutely. We have to remember, this was a world without mass communication as we know it. No internet, no printing presses, imagine that. For most people, their understanding of the universe, their place in it, it was shaped by the stories they heard from their parents and grandparents, the traditions of their community, the gods they appealed to for rain, for protection, for a good harvest.
It's fascinating, though, how even thousands of years ago, they had this very human need to find meaning and connection within their immediate surroundings, to look around and try to make sense of it all. It's something we can still relate to today, don't you think?
Absolutely. And it reminds us that these, seemingly distant civilizations, they weren't so different from us. They faced many of the same challenges, wrestled with the same existential questions: life, death, fate, the nature of the cosmos.
The big ones, right?
The big ones. And they found answers, or at least a sense of order, in stories, in rituals, in the belief in a world inhabited by these powerful, if sometimes unpredictable, forces.
Forces that weren't always, let's say, benevolent, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that these city-states were constantly at war with each other.
Indeed. Peaceful coexistence, well, it wasn't exactly their strong suit. Imagine a map constantly being redrawn, borders shifting, cities rising and falling, alliances made and broken as kings fought for dominance.
Kind of like a never-ending game of Risk, Mesopotamian style, but with, actual lives at stake.
A very apt analogy, and their pantheon, it reflects this constant state of conflict. Alongside gods of creation and the underworld, You see an abundance of warrior gods, each one embodying the ferocity, the strategic brilliance that was so prized in battle.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, if warfare is a constant threat, you want a god on your side who knows a thing or two about strategy, right? Someone who can inspire courage in your troops, maybe even strike a little fear into the hearts of your enemies.
Precisely.
Right.
And each city-state, they had their own protector deity, their own divine champion in battle. For example, Zababa was the patron god of Kish, Ningirsu of Lagash, Tishpak of Eshnini. These warrior gods, they weren't just distant figures in the heavens. They were invoked on the battlefield, appealed to for victory, their names inscribed on weapons, on banners, on the very shields that protected the soldiers.
So each city had its own, divine backup, their secret weapon in this constant struggle for power.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to see how these power dynamics, they shifted over time. For instance, when Sargon of Akkad came along, he conquered and unified many of these city-states into the first Mesopotamian empire.
Right, Sargon, the empire builder.
Exactly. And with the rise of a more centralized empire, well, we see a shift in religious focus as well.
So fewer warrior gods needed when you're not constantly in each other's throats.
In a sense, yes. The focus might have shifted towards gods who could maintain order, ensure stability and prosperity for the entire realm, not just one city-state.
It's amazing, though, how these shifts in political power, in the very fabric of their society, they're reflected in the stories they told about their gods. It really makes those myths and legends so much more than just, fantastical tales, They become these incredible windows into how these civilizations saw themselves, their relationship to the divine, their place in the grand scheme of things.
Precisely. And within these stories, within the very structure of the Sumerian-Akkadian pantheon, we see other fascinating dynamics at play, such as the concept of paired gods.
Paired gods. Okay, now you have to tell me more about that.
Well, you see, many deities, they had both male and female counterparts. This wasn't unique to Sumerian-Akkadian mythology, but it played a central role in their belief system.
So a god and a goddess working together, kind of like a divine power couple.
Well, it's more than just that. It reflects a core belief in balance, in duality. The idea that opposing forces, they weren't just in conflict, but were actually essential to the functioning of the cosmos.
So it wasn't just a matter of, say, a god of the sun and a goddess of the moon. They actually saw these pairs as two sides of the same coin, each one essential to the other.
Exactly. For example, you have Ishtar, a goddess associated with love, fertility, but also war and political power, a complex figure to be sure. And then you have her male counterpart, often associated with similar but not identical domains. They represent two sides of the same fundamental force, the same cosmic principle. And this concept of duality, this pairing of opposites, it wasn't limited to the divine. It was rooted in their observations of the natural world, the world around them.
Like how crops need both sun and rain to grow, how day follows night, ebb and flow.
Precisely. They recognized that life, in all its forms, it emerged from the interplay of seemingly opposite forces, creation and destruction, light and darkness, male and female. This understanding wasn't just a philosophical musing, it was woven into their myths, their rituals, their entire worldview.
It's like they saw this elegant balance everywhere they looked, huh? This interplay of opposites that, brought the world to life. And speaking of things that have survived for millennia, we can't talk Sumerian-Akkadian mythology without revisiting the big one, the Epic of Gilgamesh. You mentioned earlier that its influence, it spread pretty far, right? Yeah. Beyond just its home city.
Oh, absolutely. The Epic of Gilgamesh was like a blockbuster hit throughout ancient Mesopotamia and beyond. I mean, it was copied, translated, retold for centuries. And, here's where it gets really interesting, and there's evidence suggesting it might have even influenced, get this, the development of early biblical stories.
Wait, well, for real? Are we talking about, Noah's Ark here?
Yeah.
Are you saying that story might have, Mesopotamian roots?
Well, let's put on our historian hats for a sec, right?
Yeah.
So you've got the Babylonian captivity, happened around the 8th century BC. The people of Judea and Israel, they were captured, taken to Babylon. And during this time, they were, surrounded by Babylonian culture, their myths, legends, traditions, which themselves were heavily influenced by those earlier Sumerian-Akkadian traditions we've been talking about.
Okay, so they're living in Babylon, immersed in this whole other worldview, and that's where some scholars think, that the Epic of Gilgamesh might have kind of seeped into their own developing narratives.
Exactly. While direct, one-to-one connections, those are still debated, of course, but there are some pretty striking similarities between that flood narrative in Gilgamesh and the biblical story of Noah. And it's not just the flood either. Some scholars even see parallels in the creation accounts, the Garden of Eden, even in the way certain characters are depicted, certain themes that pop up in both traditions.
Well, that really gets you thinking about how interconnected these ancient cultures really were. It's like tracing the roots of a tree, how one trunk can lead to so many branches spreading out in all these unexpected directions.
A perfect analogy. And, it speaks to the power of storytelling itself, right? How these narratives, they can travel across time and space, evolving, being woven into new traditions, picking up new layers of meaning along the way.
It reminds us, too, that what we often see as, a singular thing, a story or a belief unique to one culture, it's often part of something much larger, right? This kind of interconnected tapestry of human experience and creativity.
Beautifully put. We're all part of that same tapestry, even those who lived thousands of years before us.
And on that note, any final thoughts for our listeners before we resurface from this deep dive into the world of Sumerian-Akkadian mythology?
What I find most compelling about studying a civilization as, seemingly distant as this, is how it highlights that very human need to make sense of the world around us, to impose order on chaos, to find patterns and meaning, even in the face of the unknown.
And they did that through stories, right?
Exactly. These myths, they weren't just stories to them, not just entertainment. They were explanations, justifications, ways of connecting with a universe they didn't fully understand, couldn't possibly understand, with the tools they had.
It's like they found in those narratives and those gods and goddesses reflections of their own lives, their fears, aspirations, that very human struggle to find meaning and purpose, right?
It makes you wonder, though, what will future generations see when they look back at our stories, our myths, our beliefs? What will they say about us, our values, our own attempts to grapple with the big questions?
Oh, now those are questions worth pondering.
Definitely something to think about. Well, folks, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Sumerian-Akkadian mythology. It's a world that, it continues to surprise, to challenge, and to offer some pretty incredible glimpses into, the very essence of what it means to be human. Until next time.